Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Comedian MTG. Today, I have another tournament breakdown video for you. This one's a little bit different because this is actually consisting of two different tournaments over two separate days. These were a bit smaller in scale than the usual tournaments I go to. Both of them had about 16 players each. But I figured I'd talk about these tournaments, drum up a little hype for future tournaments because some of these had a lot of potential and a really great time. I'll talk about what deck I played, my opponent's matchups, and all of the stuff from the games from this weekend. If you like videos like this, make sure to leave a comment below letting me know you enjoy these. Make sure to hit like and subscribe. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers. Thank you to each and every person who has subscribed to the channel so far. And for those of you interested in this content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that little bell so you can get notifications whenever we post new videos. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out that Patreon at patreon.com/comedianmtg. There are some amazing perks over at Patreon, including having a Comedian MTG game day soon, and patrons always get priority when it comes to pods. So, if you're interested in something like that, make sure to go check out the Patreon. So this weekend, I did actually play the same deck for both tournaments, and I want to talk about that deck because it is a deck I did spend a good amount of time trying to perfect this week, and it's an archetype that I have sort of a historic relationship with. So let's go check it out. So this is a list I call Phantom Malcolm Paradown. This is a Malcolm Keen-Eye Navigator and Vile Smasher the Fierce deck. Now, the whole point of this deck is to basically get a Glinthorn Buccaneer combo with Malcolm on the battlefield. Now, why am I playing the Grixis variant? Why am I going into blue, black, red? One, I tend to enjoy the color a little bit more than the traditional Tana version. I think having access to black and all of the tutors that black allows you to have is pretty insane. So being able to have your, unconditional things like Imperial Seal, Demonic Tutor, Diabolic Tutor, Grim Tutor, all the black tutors, things like Vamp Tutor as well, Wishclaw Talisman. So the fact that you have access to all these unconditional tutors is super strong and obviously a great way to go get your Glinthorn combo. A lot of people will go into green for their version of this list, and what I decided for working specifically with this archetype is I didn't like what had been done historically with Malcolm in specifically the Grixis space. Now, for those who have been following the channel for a while, they may remember I actually had a Malcolm Vile Smasher Opus Thief style list back when Hull Breacher was legal. When that card got banned, I stopped working on that archetype because Hull Breacher was basically a key part of that archetype. And even in that archetype, in the primer for that deck, I made multiple mentions about how the fact that I do not think Malcolm actually lends very well until a turbo ad nauseum strategy. Basically, the idea there was I was playing a lot of Rograk at the time, and it was just very clear that Rograk was better in almost every single way, minus the ability to have a one-card win condition with Glinthorn Buccaneer. That's kind of why I leaned towards the Thief-style strategy and why I made that deck more mid-range. And I've done the same thing here. Now, there are people out there who are big proponents of having Malcolm with the ad nauseum strategy, but as I said, I do not think it actually lends itself very well to that. I've spent a lot of time working on this partner combination specifically, and every single time I try to force an ad nauseam strategy, it just feels so disparate when it compares to what Malcolm is trying to do in the command zone. Malcolm's very good at being like a solid, repeatable mana engine, and I think you just lose a ton of that when you're trying to jam ad nauseum into the strategy, and also having Glinthorn as an afterthought. This deck has Glinthorn as its main focus, and also has a lot of mid-range value engines that allow you to continually grind through the game. I found that it makes mulligans insanely easy with this deck. A lot of the time with the ad nauseum variant, I would not be able to keep like turn one Malcolms because I just wouldn't be able to like generate into anything because you're sitting there with all these garbage rituals and things like that in your hand. Whereas this variant, I find that a lot of the time I can just play an early Malcolm turn one, turn two, and then follow up with something like a Tandem Lookout or like a Grazilax Ithilid Scholar, just cards that are going to allow you to make mana and continually gain card advantage with Malcolm, which I have found worked out really, really well. You may see here that I am playing Narset, and I am also playing Notion Thief. The idea was that Malcolm is actually really, really solid when it comes to having him with Wheel, so I have Wheel of Fortune, Windfall, and Whispering Madness. Because you have no innate card advantage in the command zone, I like Wheels when they're paired with Malcolm, especially Whispering Madness, as it's very hard to make sure that no one can connect with Malcolm every single turn. So being able to have this, card that allows you to dump your hand and wheel whenever you want to with Whispering Madness is actually pretty strong. So hence the inclusion of Notion Thief and Narset, because I don't want to just be throwing value at the Turbo Adnaz decks in the format. I want to be able to make sure that we are not only using these wheels to their maximum effect with our commander, but also being able to break parity on them if we get the opportunity. So let's go over the win conditions of the deck. As I mentioned, Glinthorn Buccaneer is in the deck. For those who don't know, the way this works is if you go to combat with Glinthorn Buccaneer and Malcolm, if you go to discard with Glinthorn Buccaneer's ability, what will happen is you will discard and then you will actually make 3 treasures, because Malcolm says whenever one or more pirates you control deal damage to your opponents, you create a treasure for each opponent dealt damage. So Glinthorn will make 3 treasures if you still have 3 opponents, which will allow you to have enough mana to be able to discard and draw again. And obviously this nets you a mana every time you do this, once again, as long as you have 3 opponents and you're able to ping your opponents to death by drawing and discarding whatever equal to the number of life total your opponents have. So obviously having this 1 card win condition with your commander is extremely strong, which is why I'm playing a ton of 2-hand tutors, and the black tutors are especially focused on being able to get this combo immediately. Being able to threaten this combo during the tournament was actually insanely powerful. The other win condition is the classic Thassa's Oracle in combination with Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact. Obviously, one of the premier win conditions of our format, being able to cast the Oracle with the ETB trigger on the stack, you exile your entire library, easy win. I am also playing Underworld Breach. You're in Grixis colors. It's very easy to tutor for. Unlike a Turbo Nas strategy, with this deck, I found that Underworld Breach was always just that thing in the late game that just won me the game. There were many times where I would see it early and know that I wasn't really able to pop off like a regular Turbo Nas deck would, but being more of a mid-range variant, Breach was just that inevitable piece that at the end of the game, I knew if I landed a Breach, I just won, because I would have a naturally very stocked graveyard, especially given all the wheel strategies. Mnemonic Betrayal is also worth mentioning here, because with the wheel effects in your graveyard, I'm not playing Time Twister for this very reason. The fact that I want to be able to not only use my graveyard, but also use my opponent's graveyard is actually very key. And finally, the last hard win condition, once again, we're focusing on wheels. So I actually have a very small reanimation sub-theme, playing Animate Dead and Reanimate. I might actually even play a third of these effects, but having just 2 so your hand isn't full of them, I'm not playing Entomb or anything like that. They're really just value reanimation. And not actually going too hard into a reanimator sub-theme has actually been really effective for me, because I'm able to continually play these reanimation effects and not have it be a super hard focus. This is also really cool because Reanimate and Animate Dead create a really interesting intuition pile, because you go grab Glinthorn Buccaneer and you take Reanimate and Animate Dead, and then your opponents are forced to give you a way to put Glinthorn onto the battlefield, which is actually pretty cool. So it's just a way to really consistently have your Glinthorn available when you need it. And the last hard win condition is combos with Niv Mizzet Perun. Now these combos actually work with Glinthorn as well, but those are a little more complicated. So Niv Mizzet in combination with Tandem Lookout and Curiosity actually are able to win the game. I did win multiple games with these combos specifically, because I just actually tweeted about this a little while ago, but Niv is an insane mid-range engine. So you don't really have like card advantage in the command zone with this deck. But if you're able to land a Niv Mizzet, you run away with the game wholeheartedly. It is insane how much this card puts in value. It draws you a ridiculous amount of cards. It shoots down all of your opponent's creatures. And Malcolm kind of makes it really trivial to cast Niv. There have been several games I've played with this deck since I brewed it, and every time I've had Niv in hand, I have been able to cast it within a turn or 2 of being able to see it. So the card's absolutely insane. Not only is this a great reanimation target, being able to pitch it to a card like Ledger Shredder or something like that, and then for 1 mana reanimate it later, but if you have 5 treasures and you resolve Magda, you can actually pull Niv out of your library and put it right onto the battlefield. So that synergy is pretty cool, and getting to 5 treasures really isn't that big of a deal in this deck, and Magda also just generates you more mana, so it's a pretty solid value include. It is worth noting that Tandem Lookout is not a May effect for draw, so eventually with Niv, you will have to ping your own Tandem Lookout, so you do not deck yourself. So if anyone's sleeving this deck up, just make sure you understand that interaction, because Tandem Lookout can be dangerous at times. And then I have two more sort of value reanimation targets here. And if you notice, they are both within a reasonable range to be cast. I have at 5 mana Wandering Archaic and at 6 mana Consecrated Sphinx. With Malcolm in the command zone, I do not need to reanimate these cards, which is why I don't have to go so hard into the reanimation theme, because playing this sort of mid-range Malcolm plan means that these are cards I can very easily hard cast. Wandering Archaic, I sort of trivially cast in a game yesterday on turn like 2 or 3 because I just had like a Mana Vault and a Mana Crypt, and sometimes you can just get away with having that sort of free value with a Wandering Archaic. And then Consecrated Sphinx, 6 mana when you have Malcolm is actually really not that bad. So if you're playing sort of this grindier, longer game, getting to 6, slamming a Consecrated Sphinx and just hard casting it is pretty huge, and it really does swing the game your way. I've noticed that, Sphinx doesn't always stick around, but it sticks around long enough to get you a few cards and be able to at least refill your hand. So those are the kind of value reanimations in the deck. How does the deck work as far as like mulligan wise? You're really just trying to mulligan to a turn 1 or 2 Malcolm. And if you are looking for those turn 1, 2 Malcolms, you're also looking for something to follow up with it. Either A, you're looking for a tutor like Wishclaw, so you can go grab your Glinthorn really early on. Imperial Recruiter, any of the black tutors also totally work for that. Or you're looking for a value engine, something like Magda, which will eventually get you a Niv Mizzet. Maybe something like Facebreaker, Grazilax, Tandem Lookout. Tandem Lookout puts in a ton of work. It turns out people aren't ready for like turn 1 Malcolm, turn 2 Tandem Lookout. You're drawing a card, making a treasure every turn, and it's a minimal amount of value. But if you can start connecting with Tandem Lookout and Malcolm every turn, you just start really snowballing ahead of your opponents. And the fact that you don't have card advantage in the command zone sort of gets outweighed by the fact that you're just doing really good value plays and just accruing more and more resources while not presenting a game-winning threat that's not going to make your opponents overcommit towards targeting you. I found that to be very helpful when playing this deck. You're still playing like some of the most powerful cards in the format, right? You're playing Thassa's Oracle, you're playing Underworld Breach, but you're also not very clearly trying to just like turbo out your hand. And as far as like the pace of the game is concerned, I found that really helpful because people aren't going to like hard focus and just throw a ridiculous amount of resources at you if you're not presenting something really aggressive. And it's very easy in this deck to sort of play the table police role until you're immediately presenting like a threat turn after turn, if not multiple threats a turn. That's one of the cool parts about the layering of this deck is that, for example, there was a game where I played a turn 2 Wishclaw Talisman after I played my Malcolm turn 1, and I can go into more details with that, but the fact that I was able to threaten going for the win every single turn made my opponents have to, take a back seat and like play very conservatively and not try to overcommit towards their own wins because they knew I was able to just do one tutor, win the game at any time. And the power of that in the command zone is really, really strong. In my opinion, this is the way you should be playing Grixis Malcolm. I don't think the ad nauseum strategy is very synergistic. I know a lot of people have looked into playing things like Pier and Bowls of Citadel. I have found a lot of success with this variant. I think the way it performed this weekend, not only like during these tournaments, but I also brought it and played with some friends. This deck has performed extremely consistently well, and I think it's very, very strong, and I'm very, very happy with the performance of this deck. And being able to lean more into these mid-range options, being able to play cards like Deadly Rollick with your commander who you're trying to have on the battlefield at all times and have access to SWAT and Guardianship and not have to worry about life total, being able to play your 2 mana interaction like Delay and Drown in the Lock, and being able to have these cards when you're going into the later game and being able to interact on that axis. It just kept finding itself to be relevant over and over again, and I'm very, very happy with the performance of this list. I'm very happy with the fact that I get to play a very interactive deck and be able to be putting up pretty solid results with it. So let's go through the tournament itself and go from there. So the first tournament was a 2-round tournament at Tiger's Eye Games. It was a 16-player cap tournament, and I believe we had 14 players, so there were 2 3-person pods, which is, I did not participate in any 3-person pods, but they existed. So the point of this tournament was it was just single elimination, basically the equivalent of playing a top 16. So it was single elimination. If you won your pod, you went on to the finals. If you won the finals, you got a collector box of the new set. So it was obviously a pretty awesome payout. There's a bunch of door prizes because I think it was the 1-year anniversary of the store. So it was a really, really cool time. Tiger's Eye, I've gone a couple times now. The owner is super nice, and everyone who plays there is really cool. There's like this. Both of the stores I'm going to talk about are in Bellingham, Massachusetts, and both of them have been really, really awesome to go play at. I'm driving an hour to go to these stores, and I would happily make this trip more and more because these tournaments have been really, really fun to play. The people who show up consistently are really nice, and people are coming with real decks and playing real cEDH decks, and it's pretty cool to play against. So Tiger's Eye, let's go over round one of this tournament. So it was in first position was Old Stick Fingers, followed by Blue Farm. Then it was me on Malcolm Vile Smasher, and finally there was Urza. So this game was pretty interesting because Old Stick Fingers very clearly got out to a fast start. They had a mana vault on turn one, and were basically threatening to try and go off as early as turn two. The blue farm player next to me was sort of in a weird position where they had to like threaten interaction at any point. I was able to get out an early Malcolm and then next turn be able to play a tandem lookout, which I soul bonded onto my Malcolm. So I started gaining a lot of value by being able to hit my opponents, draw a card, and make a treasure. The tables sort of did this waiting thing. Urza was just kind of holding up mana and passing because I think they were a little threatened by what was happening with the old Stick Fingers board. Stick Fingers went for a win. It got countered by me. It got back to my turn, and I played Grazilax. So not only do I have Malcolm with Tandem Lookout being able to draw cards, but I have Grazilax in the battlefield as well. So with that combination, I was able to start hitting people and drawing 4 cards and making a treasure every time I was going to combat. So I was definitely snowballing a great deal of advantage, but Stick Fingers didn't seem like they wanted to keep stopping trying going for the win. They went for the win again on their turn, and it was once again stopped. I didn't really have a lot of interaction at the time, and it kind of put the blue farm player in like a weird place. Basically, by the time it got back to me, I had 7 cards in hand. I didn't have a lot of interaction, but I had 1 counter spell, and I believe it was a Flusterstorm specifically, and I had enough mana to be able to use an Imperial Seal to put Thassa's Oracle on top of my library. When I went to combat, I was able to draw the cards off of Grazilax and Malcolm. The blue farm player actually did a really smart move by playing Crom and leaving it back as a blocker. So instead of being able to draw 4 cards, I was only able to draw 3 during combat. But obviously, like cutting me off card advantage there was pretty strong. And then I just had enough cards where I was able to play Thassa's Oracle, play Demonic Consultation. I had a good amount of mana in reserves. I had backup with Flusterstorm. I was really debating whether to try and Flusterstorm to protect my own win, because if I made everyone use their interaction, I had a feeling Stick Fingers won when it got back to their turn. But luckily, I had exactly enough with the Flusterstorm to be able to stop my opponent stopping my win, and I was able to get there with just classic old Oracle Consultation after drawing a ridiculous amount of cards with Malcolm and Tandem Lookout and Grazilax. So the TLDR of that round was we had one player consistently putting a threat on the table, and that removed a lot of the burden off of me. I was able to play once again, as I was talking about during the deck tech, like this ability to be able to play these engines that are drawing me a bunch of cards and gaining me a ton of advantage without immediately threatening to win the table until I did, which I was able to pull that Thassa's Console out of nowhere, basically, for my opponent. So I was able to gain steady advantage repeatedly, and eventually was able to take that game. So that's game 1. Round 2 is tough. So Inala had won their round 1 pod before we had gotten to our second turn. So I was a little nervous about Inala popping off early, but luckily I was playing with players who were smart enough to respect the fact that Inala was on the play. Seat 1 was Inala, Seat 2 was Thrasios Crom, Seat 3 was Blue Farm, and Seat 4 was myself. This one was tough. So going last obviously was a bit of a pain, but what I was able to do was just turn 1, play a Soul Ring. I kept the hand because it was turn 1 Soul Ring, a bunch of lands, some interaction, and Glinthorn just in hand. So obviously that was like pretty solid. I had ramp, I had acceleration, all those things. So turn 1, I top deck an Arcane Signet, so I was able to go land, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, hold up interaction, which was pretty cool. I had Mind Break Trap too, which is obviously a huge card against Inala. So if Inala's trying to pop off, having a Mind Break Trap was going to be a crippling card against that deck. Mind Break Trap was in hand. I was able to pass to my Inala opponent. They were a little stuck on lands. They only had a Volcanic Island and a Soul Ring at the time, and because of that, they were kind of playing a patient game, on top of the fact that it was pretty clear that all of us were respecting Inala going off pretty early. So my opponent was very smart about, waiting the appropriate amount of time to be able to try and pop off. So turn 2, I get a Malcolm out. Things are still a little tense at the table. Anala tries to get one spell going off, but it gets stopped. Thrasios Crom is just generating a bunch of card advantage and just sort of trying to do the whole play Thrasios, play Training Grounds, play Mana Crypt, that kind of thing going on. It gets back to me. I do play the Glint Horn. At this point, it's very clear that my opponents all are kind of low on interaction after having to deal with Anala, and then Blue Farm was kind of getting a little cheeky and like tapping out for a Loyal Apprentice and to Timna. So my opponents were tapped really low. So I played Glint Horn. It resolves. I go to move to combat, and my opponent shows me an Otawara, which sucked because I had an Offer You Can't Refuse and Mind Break Trap in hand, and obviously neither of those cards deal with an Otawara. But I had Demonic Consultation in hand, and I did the math in my head. It was very clear that Inala was down to 2 cards. They were going to try and win on their turn. If I let the Otawara resolve and have Glinthorn bounce back to my hand, I would immediately become a present threat at the table. I had a couple of value engines in hand, but it was enough that I wasn't able to resolve any of them and be able to set myself up for the next couple turns. So I would kind of be on the back foot. Or if I resolve Consult and go get Deflecting Swat, there is like a 90% chance I win this game right now. So I needed Deflecting Swat basically not to be in the top 6 cards of my library, or not to be one of the last cards of my library, so that I could use Glinthorn and not be able to deck myself. And what ended up happening was I cast the Consultation. Meanwhile, I thought about this play for a good amount of time, because I was like, if this goes wrong, I just straight up die here, whereas I could be in a scenario in which Glinthorn comes back to my hand and I'm a little bit behind the table, but maybe I can do something because I still have some interaction pieces. But in my brain, I said, I'd rather take the, reasonably high chance right now that I resolve one spell and just take this game right now than try and play a longer game. Now, obviously, with what I'm about to say, hindsight being 2020, I could have played a slower route, but I think the odds were still pretty solid that I got there. So I cast Demonic Consultation, and unfortunately, the third card on my library was Deflecting Swat, so I ended up losing the game on the spot, which was rather heartbreaking, but sometimes it happens. You die to your own Demonic Consultation. But I was super proud of the performance of the deck, given these 2 games. The fact that I was able to threaten a turn 3 win with multiple pieces of protection in that finals pod, the fact that I was able to win the first pod with having a stacked amount of interaction in my hands, drawing a ton of cards, and then being able to answer the threats of the table at the same time. The performance of the deck was extremely awesome, and I was very, very happy with how it was playing out. You're going to consistently hear me be saying that about this deck from this weekend, because it performed exceptionally well. So great performance day 1. The fact that I was an unlucky flip away from winning the entire thing with this deck and it consistently performing, and the fact that I was able to do that even though I was going 4th in this pod made me really happy with the performance from day 1. The game went on for a while, and Nala tried to win. They fizzled, and eventually it got back to the Blue Flame player, who resolved the Peer into the Abyss and got there. So that's how that game finally ended. So tournament number 2, I went back to ELD's Time Vault games. If you remember, my last tournament report was from this very store. Now, the numbers at the last tournament were a little bit larger. We only had 16 people at this one, and I think that was just a matter of this one didn't get the same level of marketing, and there was a Team Trios event happening literally around the corner at a different store, so it was unfortunate the timing with that. The attendance was a little lower. So the way this tournament worked was, instead of single elimination, it was 3 rounds of Swiss and then a cut to the finals, which for a smaller tournament, I really did enjoy that structure. And we can talk more about the details of the tournament as we go forward. But let's talk about round 1. So round 1, I played against the Stick Fingers pilot from the previous day. In second place was me, then third was Kinnan, and last was Esper Malcolm, so Timna Malcolm. And so this pod was really interesting because it was a lot of the first 2 turns, everyone's kind of developing their card advantage engines. I had played Malcolm turn 1, and then turn 2 was able to play a Tandem Lookout, draw a card, and I only had 1 mana up, and my interaction was all 2 mana interaction. Unfortunately, I think I had the Lay in hand. Kinnan had tapped out to be able to play a Kinnan and some sort of mana producer, and Timna Malcolm had tapped out to be able to play a Timna following their Malcolm. So by the time it got around to Stick Fingers' turn 3, who had all they had played was land, Sensei's Divining Top, land, pass. And then turn 3, out of nowhere, they go Dark Ritual into Cabal Ritual into playing Stick Fingers into Reanimation Spell. And all of us were kind of just like not ready for that to happen. Like, it's a very proactive deck, but we thought they just kept a super shady hand. And so no one had interaction. We easily could have interacted had the opportunity arisen, like had any of us tapped differently. But it was just one of those things where no one was expecting the Stick Fingers deck, who had just played land pass 2 turns in a row, to just get there out of nowhere, which was rather unfortunate because, you know, it did feel kind of bad to just be like, oh, we all just kind of just didn't have it round 1. So it was a bit of an awkward time. It was also sad because Kinnan was able to brainstorm in response to the Stick Fingers, and just the top 3 cards were all just like 1 mana interaction, and they only had 1 mana to cast the brainstorm. So it was a rather unfortunate game 1, but kind of a non-game. Those happen sometimes, you know. That's kind of on the pod for, you know, just going for heads down, developing our engines in a game that has a deck that is a little more proactive. But yeah, as I said, it was a total misread by the table because we were not ready for Dark Ritual into Cabal Ritual into Reanimation Spell win the game. And we got punked by Stick Fingers. So yeah. Round 2 was me, then the same Esper Malcolm deck from last round, Inala, who happened to actually be the same Inala player from the last tournament the day before, and a Blue Farm deck. This game was awesome. It was one of the most interactive games I have played in a really long time. It was super grindy, super interactive. Everybody had something to do at the table. It was so cool. I was playing some card advantage engines. My opponents were also kind of doing their thing. Anala was doing the thing where they had a turn 1 dockside that made 3 mana, and then they just had like very evidently Spellseeker mana at all times, and were just kind of threatening to, as soon as one of us, you know, stopped kind of being responsible, just go for the win. There was a lot of tension with Anala being very clearly able to pop off at any time. And this was the game that I had mentioned earlier where I was able to go turn 1 Malcolm, turn 2 Wishclaw Talisman. So Inala was also being respectful of the fact that if they screwed the pooch immediately, I was just able to go Wishclaw Talisman, get Glinthorn, win the game, which also forced the Esper Malcolm player to my left to really have to weigh a lot of their decision making and, you know, do things like tutor for a Force of Will to stop me. But also that happened right before the Inala player's turn. Also, meanwhile, there's 2 Esper Sentinels on the table, and like that's a big part of this too, is that, you know, anyone who tries to pop off is drawing everyone else a ton of cards. A Ristic Study comes down at one point. So the advantage engine sort of clashing on top of the fact that there's 2 decks that could threaten to go off on their turn. Clearly, like there's no ambiguity about it. There's 2 people who very clearly can go off at any time. But meanwhile, I have this threat of going for the win. I'm playing a deck that, as I mentioned, is meant to be able to keep going even though I'm threatening the win, right? I have this thing that is just on the battlefield saying I'm going to win at any time because I have a 1-card win condition, but I have Malcolm and a bunch of card advantage engines that are allowing me to continually develop my board if I'm not going for the win. Eventually, I get to the point where I have enough treasures to just hard cast Niv Mizzet, and that really warped the game. Like, it significantly warped the game. I started shooting down creatures on the battlefield. I started popping all of the Esper Sentinels so my opponents weren't drawing cards off of the things I was doing. At one point, Inala had actually hit me with Ragavan and revealed my Underworld Breach, and was able to try and cast that, but I had cast a delay on it. So not only was all of this happening with me being able to threaten a Glinthorn and having Niv Mizzet, but also I have a delayed Underworld Breach that, for anyone confused by that interaction, Underworld Breach actually will come down on my battlefield when those 3 time counters are up. Even though my opponent cast it, it was my Underworld Breach. So meanwhile, there's this ticking clock of I just have an Underworld Breach coming onto the battlefield at any time. So that's happening, and that's definitely a threat on the table, it was so funny that was happening. It was very amusing. And so there's this like back and forth happening where I'm shooting down my opponent's Ragavans. I have my own Ragavan, and for those who don't know, Ragavan with Malcolm is absolutely cracked. You're making 3 treasures if you hit with those 2 and revealing a card with Ragavan, which is, you know, how I got to the Niv Mizzet mana in the first place, is having this Malcolm Ragavan interaction. So I'm just gaining a ton of value, and it finally goes back to my turn. My blue farm opponent plays a Ristic Study, which obviously made things a little tense, and everyone's kind of looking around knowing that I have Underworld Breach about to resolve. I have Glinthorn tutor possibility at any time, and I have a Niv Mizzet on the battlefield. So my blue farm opponent, with the Underworld Breach suspend trigger on the stack, goes to cast a Silence. And what ensues is probably like a 15 card interaction battle, because every time I'm casting something, I get a Niv Mizzet trigger. So I'm drawing a ton of cards. They're drawing me a ton of cards. There's a Ristic Study also drawing a ton of cards, and an Esper Sentinel until it gets shot. So there's just this insane battle back and forth. I don't have the most interaction in my hand, so at one point I actually crack my Wishclaw Talisman to go get a Flusterstorm to be able to stop the silence on top of like 3 counter spells on top of my misstep for the silence being cast. This interaction was absolutely insane, and like 40 spells had been cast for the time I was able to go to my draw step. So there's this insane stack happening. It gets to the point where I finally counter silence. I go to cast a dockside that I had drawn eventually, and I vamp tutored for the dockside. So because I knew I was tapping so low for all this interaction, I needed a way to recover out of this. They tapped me basically out because I go to cast the dockside, and there was also a force of will that my opponent had. So they force of will my dockside. I now have no mana up, but I still have my commander and Ragavan. So I'm able to go to combat. And meanwhile, I've been shooting down all of the creatures on the board, knowing this scenario may occur, and I need to get in with Ragavan and Malcolm. So I go to combat, I hit my opponents, I'm back up to 3 mana now. Meanwhile, I do want to highlight a play that I did that ended up paying off extremely well. Before going to my turn, I actually used a Deadly Rollick on the opponent to my left's Malcolm, and it seemed like a very aggressive move, but what I was actually doing was I was, 1, baiting interaction, and 2, shutting off the ability for my opponents to use Fierce Guardianship. And I ended up doing the same thing with my Timna Crom opponent later on, because every time I was getting a Niv Mizzet trigger, I was shooting down Timna and then respectively Crom, because I knew I was able to shut off more and more interaction in my opponent while that like 17 interaction moment was happening. So I found out later my opponent had to dig through a large portion of their library because they couldn't name Fierce Guardianship with the Tainted Pact, or not name it, but they couldn't find Fierce Guardianship with Tainted Pact. And so the Deadly Rock play actually ended up paying major dividends, and shooting down my opponent's commanders with my Niv Mizzet triggers ended up once again playing huge dividends. So back to my second main phase, I have 3 treasures now because I've hit my opponents with Ragavan and Malcolm. I'm able to recast the dockside out of my yard, which makes something like 6 treasures at this point. And I also just happen to have drawn a Curiosity at this point. So I put Curiosity on Niv Mizzet, I cast a single spell, and I can kill my opponents. But it was a really fun time, and it was a really, really solid interactive pod, and that was super, super cool. Round 3. Round 3 was wild. So it was Yuriko who got a turn 1 Nashi onto the battlefield, which was insanely threatening for the entire game. Next then was me on Malcolm Vile Smasher. On third was Dina, the Soul Steeper, which is sort of an Exquisite Blood combo deck that also has some like unique life gain stuff going on there. And then last place was Timna Crom, but it wasn't Blue Farm. It actually ended up being this like Timna Crom control deck, which I was not ready for, and I made several misevaluations during this game because I wasn't ready for it to literally be Timna Crom interaction deck. The way the game ended up playing, Nashi exiled like all of my win cons. First time it hit me, it flips over my Thassa's Oracle. Second time it hit me, it flips over my Brain Freeze. Third time it hits me, it exiles my Niv Mizzet. So now I'm literally down to just Glinthorn Buccaneer. Meanwhile, this Timna Crom control deck is being very aggressive about removing all of our stuff, to the point where like I got my Malcolm Washawayed. So this deck is very aggressively just interacting with the table, and has an Archivist of Ogma that got out turn 1, so not really getting punished for interacting with the table, just interacting over and over and over again, and being able to just continually refuel because opponents are playing fetch lands, or I'm stuck at the hand with like 4 tutors, which was so frustrating at the time. Meanwhile, that's happening, but this Nashi is just running away with the game, and it was interesting because the interaction wasn't going towards Nashi because the Timna Crom control player basically showed them a Swords of Plowshares and said, don't send it my way. And despite my protests about letting them get away with that play, it kept happening over and over again. Eventually the swords went away because Nashi flipped over once again my Niv Mizzet, so swords had to be used on that so that the Yuriko player didn't just absolutely steamroll this game. It was a tough game. I, at one point, tried to reanimate Consecrated Sphinx. That got immediately blown up by the Timna Crom player. So I was on the back foot for the entirety of the game, and I was down to just Glinthorn Buccaneer for my game-winning combos. And on top of that, Yuriko had also played a Curse Totem. So I also just straight up couldn't activate the 1-win condition I had left. So I was in a very desperate spot for a really long time. Now, what's this? The tempo of the game keeps going back and forth. There's a couple board wipes that happen. Some creatures die, stuff like that. I'm able to start removing the Nashi. I meanwhile also have a Ledger Shredder on my battlefield that's at this point, I think it had like 6 power. So it was insane. Dina wiped the board a couple times. And so we're at this point where the game is just turning into a slog and nobody's getting anywhere. And turns is called, and my turn is turn 0. Dina had revealed that they had Abrupt Decay, and I had just totally spaced on it, which was a major punt on my half. But I tutor for Underworld Breach. Meanwhile, I'm under a lot of pressure in this table too, because my life total is down to like 7. I had to wipe a number of Yuriko's creatures because of the fact that I was just being constantly hit, despite not being on ad nauseum, but no one at the table was on ad nauseum. So I kept getting constantly pressured by the Yuriko player. So I'm down to like 7 life, and I'm kind of pressured into making a move. What ends up happening is I cast an Underworld Breach, which I realized with the way priority worked, I would only be able to get a single spell from my graveyard off before the Abrupt Decay happened. I did not have a single bounce spell. I did not have a single way to save my breach. I didn't have Deflecting Swat. I didn't have a way I could tutor for Deflecting Swat. So there was no instant speed thing I could do to try and stop the Abrupt Decay happening. I knew I got 1 spell. My graveyard was Mnemonic Betrayal. So I thought to myself, okay, I can at least cast this Mnemonic Betrayal and try and win with my opponent's graveyards. At this point, I was really tight on mana, and looking around at my opponent's graveyards, because of the way their decks were, Mnemonic Betrayal did absolutely nothing. There was a turbo interaction deck across the table that just had a bunch of interaction in the yard and 1 mana vault. Yuriko had a bunch of ninjas in the graveyard and counter spells, and Dina had some fetch lands and like a Fiend Artisan in the graveyard. And so I get the Mnemonic Betrayal off, and all I was really able to do was cast a Dam out of the Timnachrom control player's graveyard and completely wipe the board. And what happened was, because of that board wipe, and because the Timnachrom player had a ton of interaction, we ended up going to a draw, which was rather unfortunate. I would have loved to have been able to win that game, but I also was a clown and did not play around the Abrupt Decay. And yeah, that's super my bad. But I was also in a desperate spot. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to live through the turn cycle anyways, so it was really tough. So that was the 3 rounds of Swiss. Unfortunately, with the way the pairing system worked for this tournament, there was a significant amount of chance anyone who has won 1-1, so 1 win, 1 loss, 1 draw, made it to the finals. But the people who played round 1 and who won round 1 all got into a pod together and split. So they decided to draw round 2, meaning that they basically had insane breakers going into round 3. So it was almost inevitable that because they went for that move, most other people who were 1-1 wouldn't actually be able to advance to the finals pod. I had the record to be in the finals pod, but because of the way the breakers had broken down during this tournament, I was unable to actually get to the finals pod. So that is where my run in this tournament ended. Although I'm extremely happy with my performance in it. I was able to threaten the win repeatedly in the games. I, had an unlucky round 1, but you play a multiplayer tournament repeatedly, and rounds like that happen all the time. So the fact that I was able to have 2 really solid games and be able to, insinuate that had I not been under the constriction of turns during that 3rd round, and in a game where it seemed like I was out of the game many, many times, and I was able to continually get back into it, threaten to win, threaten a major card advantage engine over and over again, even though I thought I was in a terrible position. Really made me excited about the power of this deck and the ability to pilot it to this really, really competitive level. So I'm very, very happy with my performance on this deck this weekend, and it's been really exciting to be able to talk about this with you all today. So that's where my tournament ended. I believe one of the new cards from Commander Legends actually ended up taking the whole thing. It's the new Grixis Commander that allows you to replicate things for each of your opponents. I'll put a picture of it right here. That ended up taking down the entire tournament, which is pretty cool. It was a deck I hadn't even really thought was going to be a cool thing, but they basically said they were doing like Grixis value stuff, and occasionally, you get 3 intuitions, 3 Jessica's Will, 3 thought seizes on your opponents, and apart from that, it was just like a Grixis value pile. So it was pretty cool to hear that deck was able to take it down. It's a brand new archetype for their format, so that's kind of cool. And that's it. I hope you all enjoyed this tournament breakdown. I'm going to try and get this out as soon as possible. If you enjoy content like this, please make sure to hit like and subscribe. If you want to see me do more of these, please leave it in the comments and down below. Was there any of these matches you thought were really interesting? I'd love to hear your comments down below. Do you have any of the decks that you weren't expecting to hear were in this tournament? I know there was definitely a few that really surprised me, and it was all in all a really great time. Huge shout out to ELD's Time Vault Games. Huge shout out to Tiger's Eye Games. Both amazing stores in Bellingham, Massachusetts. Worth the drive every single time for me, and I'm really happy to be able to continually now go out and do these in real life events again. It feels so nice to be able to get out and just play cEDH at the level I love to play at. And I'll definitely leave some information. I'll be making public posts about when the next of these tournaments is going to be happening. So if you have any interest in that, leave a comment down below or hit me up in the Discord. Once again, you can always jump in our Discord and check out the Comedian MTG Discord. I am there a good amount. You can ask me any sort of questions, and if I'm not working, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoy this tournament report. We'll see you guys later. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gon' feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing. Take me for granted and you know I'm leaving. I'ma take what's mine with the webs I'm weaving. I could take this crowd from seeing to believing.